Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest on for the first time, Daniel Plotkin. If you're not familiar with him, he is a PhD student at Auburn University, and he is an author on numerous hypertrophy related research papers and a lot of good ones too, ones that I think are pretty popular in the field. So really looking forward to chatting with you today, man, and really appreciate you taking time out of your day to hop on here and chat about all this nerdy stuff.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I'm excited.
Yep, looking forward to it. So real quick, just to give the audience just a general overview of you, maybe briefly go over your background, how you got into, where you're at today with this field.
Yeah, so I did my undergrad in Queens College, and that was in nutrition exercise science. And maybe I'll rewind a little bit. In high school, I wrestled, and that's when I got into, like lifting weights makes you stronger, and body composition is a thing. And I got obsessed with, I can cut like 15 pounds in a day and be bigger than these guys when I actually wrestled them and stuff like that. So I got obsessed with the science of just performance and body composition in high school. So that's why I pursued it in college. So I did my undergrad in nutrition and exercise science. I did my master's with Brad Schoenfeld with a focus on muscle hypertrophy. And now I'm continuing on the path of really trying to understand what causes muscle to grow, how best to grow muscle in Auburn University, where we also look at molecular aspects of how muscle grows. So not only changing variables in order to see how best to grow muscle, but also on the molecular level, what's going on in the cell, why is it growing, how is it growing, and so on.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's really cool, man. You worked under, or you worked with Brad Schoenfeld. Obviously, everyone who is familiar with him, I feel like that if you're familiar with any of the research around hypertrophy, actually just had Max Coleman on a couple weeks ago, and I know he is currently working with Brad Schoenfeld as well at his lab, or maybe he's taking a break right now and is trying to get. I can't remember for sure. And then also, yeah, at Auburn, I know Mike Roberts is like the main guy there, right? At
He's the
Auburn,
head of the lab, yeah. And
head of the
Max
lab.
is still heading studies with Brad. So me and Max actually became good friends. He did his undergrad in Auburn with Dr. Roberts, then came to New York to study under Brad while I was there, and we overlapped for a year and a half. And then now I switched places with him. Now I'm in Auburn. So yeah, we kind of
That's funny.
swapped.
You guys swapped. Yeah. I know Mike Roberts, like I always think of his like research as like super nerdy, super detailed, like stuff like that, like you said. But it sounds like it's a combination there. You guys do some like regular kind of research too, but then like you said, molecular, which is very, I feel like nerdy, sciencey type stuff there with that.
Yeah, you can layer it on. So you can still ask the normal questions. For example, you might ask like what volumes are better for hypertrophy, but you'll measure it using the normal applied stuff and ultrasound, but you'll also take muscle biopsies and see, okay, which part of the cell is reacting more to the training? Are there more mitochondria due to this type of training? Is there more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy during another type of training? So you can ask just different questions when you can take muscle tissue as opposed to just macro, did the muscle grow or not type thing.
Yeah, like actually what's going on, like you said, what's going on under the hood,
Yeah.
basically, with everything. You PhD student, what kind of got you to want to pursue that route towards everything? I think it's really cool you're doing that. I know that science is very challenging and everything, so I appreciate everything you do and respect all the work and everything like that. What kind of led you to want to do the academic side of things?
Yeah, I should say that I've been personal training. So I started personal training when I was 18 as well. So I've been personal training for about 10 years now, and then some online coaching. So definitely keep my feet wet with the applied side of things. But I got obsessed with science probably around, like I said, the high school wrestling era. But then as I learned more and more, I got really enchanted with how can we answer hard questions and get closer to the truth. And just using anecdotes and what's been working for people in the gym, you notice very quickly isn't really what helps you get there. It's an important piece of the puzzle for sure, but trying to isolate variables and really see what's going on was fascinating. You're like, okay, what kind of study design can I use in order to get at this question? And then that question turns into 1,000 more questions. So it's a never-ending puzzle, and I got obsessed with that. So here I am, a student for life. I
Unfortunately,
think
yep.
I think I have 2 more years and then no more school, I promise.
Yeah, no, that's really cool, and I think it's cool, especially too, when not only are you doing some of the research, but you're also working with clients as well too, which I feel like it is a little bit different, right? And so I think it's good to be able to do both of
Yeah.
those.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you, by going the academic side of things, taken that route as well too? Is there any maybe takeaways or anything that you've learned that maybe you feel like you wouldn't have if you didn't go that route or anything like that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, you can easily overemphasize the science, and I think sometimes people tend to go down the rabbit hole and not realize the limitations. So there are definitely things that can go wrong. But once you get a really good handle of things, I think the biggest takeaway is often one, having a really good sense of what we know and don't know, so that you have the flexibility to do a lot of things with a client when you're troubleshooting. So when you really know that, oh, like we can't hang our hat on this mechanism, or this population may not necessarily apply to another population, or just even understanding that group averages may not apply in certain instances, you start to really be able to give yourself the room to experiment and use a sound rationale. You can use the physics, which is obviously part of science. You can use mechanisms. You can use applied data from other populations and put that all together to try to troubleshoot for an individual while giving yourself that wiggle room and not being like, oh, this study showed this, so I'm only going to do this. And if it's not working, that means the person's not working and so on. So I think a lot of the time it almost allows you more play and more art than people might realize.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. That's what I was getting at with that. And I think with research too, as I've gotten into it more, and when I say gotten into it, just reviewed more papers, things like that. Like when I look back when I first got into it, it's like you see a paper and it's, oh, it says this, that's how it's done. And then you don't really understand what goes into the research process, right? Again, getting what population you have, some of the challenges that you have with studies as well too that go into it. It's like almost like coaching a bunch of clients, and anybody who coaches clients knows that things don't always go how you want them to. And then, yeah, just looking a little bit deeper rather than just, I guess I always heard, hey, don't just read the abstract or anything like that. And it never really clicked exactly what that meant. But now, as I've gotten further into it, it's, you really do need to look into these things a little bit more versus, hey, the study says this and that's how it should be. There's probably a little bit more that you need to go into. And that's part of why I wanted to get you on here today, was to talk about some of your studies in a little bit more detail, to maybe hear about some of those nuances that maybe people don't pick up on by just reading the abstract or social media or anything like that.
Yeah, for sure. Word limits are a problem.
Yep.
I don't know any sort of, especially scientist who's trying to inform applied science that isn't mad at the fact that they can't get everything into an abstract. So we really do hope that people click to the full text and get a little bit more nuance. Yeah.
In today's world, though, that's a challenge, right? People want the, hey, what's the two sentence or one sentence takeaway here, and what should I do
Yeah.
with that? With your PhD, just curious to learn a little bit more. What is it? Just going to be like hypertrophy? Is there anything specific that you're going to be looking at, or anything like that? Or yeah, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so I've been obsessed with for a while, probably before the craze, in terms of what's going on with length mediated hypertrophy type stimuli. Why do muscles grow better at longer muscle lengths? And even before that was like super obvious in humans, just what's the difference in anabolic stimuli from working a muscle at different ranges of motion? So is there a different cascade of events that goes on when you are hitting a muscle at a longer length versus a mid length versus a shorter length? And how does that differ between muscles? So, my hope is that we can do an applied study that uses probably something along the lines of a long length partial, but get serial acute biopsies. So, a biopsy right after the bout, and then a biopsy maybe 1 hour, 4 hours, and 8 hours after the bout, to look at a lot of sort of candidate anabolic signaling markers and stretch mediated mechanosensing signaling markers in order to try to get at what's going on and perhaps what are the differences between the two stimuli. So is it something with titin being phosphorylated? Is it something with DGK zeta, which is another protein that signals MPS? Basically, what does that picture look like? And can we draw inferences from the molecular data to guess what's going to go on weeks down the line? And that's honestly, and as we were talking about before, really hard to do. So we currently don't really have anything we can hang our hat on in an acute sense where, okay, we measured this And now for sure we know that in 8 weeks they're going to grow more. So let's say they do about, we measure XYZ. We can't with any sort of granularity tell you that this group is gonna grow more. So my hope is that one, we can find things that can be more predictive of hypertrophy, but two, we can start getting at mechanisms of mechanosensing and which ones play a larger role.
And when you say play a larger role, you're saying specifically in like stretch mediated hypertrophy or long muscle length or just anything in general, really, at that
Just
point.
hypertrophy in general. So I'm attacking it from, all right, I want to understand the mechanisms of stretch mediated hypertrophy, but that'll probably lend itself to understanding hypertrophy in general because one group is going to be doing a shorter bias and another group is going to be doing a long. If you see a different quote unquote signature, then you're like, okay, maybe these proteins, signaling molecules, etc., are more involved in a shorter mediated hypertrophy while these are involved in a longer mediated. And it's honestly really hard to do, and you need a lot more than a small sample of muscle tissue from. So I don't have any, I don't have any illusions of grandeur that I'm going to solve the problem with one study. It's probably going to take probably
Multiple.
hundreds of studies in order to really get at what's going on, especially because there's a lot of redundancy. So just because you see something go up and another thing go up, it could be that both of them contribute to hypertrophy, right? But it could be that if you took one totally away, that second one would be enough to get the same exact hypertrophy stimulus. It's just within biology, we have a lot of sort of fail safes where just because something breaks down doesn't mean that the whole system breaks down. And if anything, it could run almost at 100% efficiency. So untangling that web is almost actually impossible to do in humans. That's why we have mouse models where we can actually knock out genes. And that's why we have cell lines that we can manipulate pretty much anything we want to try to get at the really basic questions and then try, and this is a huge try to extrapolate that to humans.
Yeah, and I'm sure once you find that out, that will just probably lead to more questions and more things to to study as well too after that. Speaking of mechanisms of hypertrophy, and again, I think you were just saying in general, do you still fall in line with kind of the three main ones that were touted in Brad Schoenfeld's paper? Again, I think it's metabolic, muscle damage, and mechanical tension would be the third one. Would that kind of fall under the same line there of what you'd be looking at and maybe trying to find other ones, or would they tie in again, untangling that web of all that as well too?
Yeah, so with the design that I'm thinking of, it would probably only be looking at tension and different types of tension and the signaling associated with that
Gotcha.
kind of tension. Is it that myonuclei flatten more when you are in the stretch mediated position and there's certain signaling molecules related to that? So I'd only be really attacking one of those prongs because you need to isolate that. You couldn't really think of a study in order to try to get at all three of them because then there wouldn't really be isolation. There's always going to be overlap. Anytime there's tension, there's always going to be other things too. So that's another huge limitation. Like I'm looking at tension, mechanosensing type signaling, but it's possible that a long length partial, not possible, it's probable that a long length partial probably produces some different metabolic slash damage slash other unknown mechanism we're not aware of. So even that's the problem with mechanistic research. Even if you're really meticulous about the things you measure, there's tons of things that you couldn't account for because you can't measure everything that could be feeding in to what your measurement is. So that's why you never want to draw super strong conclusions from mechanistic research, but you can definitely start getting inklings at, all right, what's going on in humans in the sort of whole system? What have we seen in animal models? And piece that together.
Yeah,
But
that
yeah, I
makes
definitely do fall in line with believing that those three can contribute to hypertrophy. I think it's definitely popular to dismiss a lot of the other mechanisms without realizing how complicated the system is and how different things can even modulate tension. For example, so the pump, people talk about cell swelling. When you have a sarcomere, there's ascending limb, a descending limb, and a sort of a plateau region. And the descending limb is when you get most of that stretch slash passive tension. If you swell a muscle, and this has been shown in some animal models, you can actually have a longer descending limb. So a longer amount of stretch mediated type signaling potentially because you have more runway for stretch. So you could literally have tension be the only mechanism, but even like hypothetically, let's say, but swelling would modulate that tension. So there's a whole lot of things to unpack when it comes to really piecing together the mechanisms.
Like you said, it's hard to just do one without the other ones, whether they're a byproduct or whatever it is. It's hard to separate those there with that. Cool. So before we dive into your some of the studies, just real briefly, I want to hear what does training look like for you? Is there anything specific that you train for or anything like that? Or yeah, I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to get as jacked as possible while not falling apart in jiu-jitsu. I like to stay active, get better at, trying to be, a human weapon, so to speak, while realizing that I'm going to be really bad when there's people that sleep in the gym and I'm just training once or twice a week, maybe. So I'm definitely getting my ass kicked a bunch, but while trying to get my ass kicked, I'm trying to preserve my joints so I can get as jacked as possible. I lift 6 days a week and it's like a full body split, but mostly upper, lower, modulating back and forth between that. But then I typically try to hit muscle groups that recover better more often. So it's like a hybrid program where it's not really upper lower. It's more like upper lower with a whole bunch of stuff you wouldn't expect to be in different upper lower days because certain muscles, for me specifically, recover a bit better or worse. So I'll hit them more or less often.
What are some of those muscles that you find for either of those for you?
Yeah, so for me, and this is contrary to other people, and it could be that something else is the limiter, not the muscle itself. For example, if I do any more than 6 sets of bicep, my tendon is not my friend at all. So my bicep tendon. So I'll hit bicep a lot more often. So currently I have it in 4 times per week. So 4 of my 6 sessions I'm hitting bicep, but each of those times it's just 3 sets. And that allows me to do a little bit more in terms of in jiu-jitsu where I'm not super worried about my tendon flaring up even more. And it ensures that it's not going to hold back my back training and things like that. Another muscle that is not limited, but I feel like if it's recovering super well, I'll hit it again is lateral delts. So my lateral delts, pretty much no matter what I do, they seem to be okay for the next session. So is it for sure growing me more muscle, the fact that I hit them 3 times per week? Maybe not, but I think this is where we started, where it seems like there's no distinct downside to doing that. And it's a muscle I definitely want to grow. So I hit it a bit more often now.
Yeah, those are typically the ones that, like you said there, if you have upper lower split, those are the two muscle groups I usually find that when I'm programming for clients, they end up being in the lower body kind of session, just because, again, like you said, you can potentially hit them with a little bit more frequency. Do you have to modulate like the intensity that you use with those muscle groups, or do you find that even though you train them 4 times a week, like you can still ramp up that intensity each session?
In terms of, so intensity is a nebulous
Yeah,
word in terms, so do you mean
like
like,
close to failure.
yeah, so I typically for those muscle groups take most of my sets pretty close. So 1-0 is how it shows up in my sheet. So it's either one reserve for earlier sets and no reps in reserve for later sets. I also tend to utilize for lateral delt specifically a bit more drop set sort of esque type training. So I would say, especially for the lateral delt, I don't worry as much. For the bicep, because of the tendon issues, I tend to sometimes leave a little bit more, but it really seems to be for me a volume issue more than it is a proximity to failure issue. So I don't worry too much about it when it's just that 3 sets. It might be that I would turn the dial a little bit more if I was doing more sets. So, for example, if I was doing 6 to 9 sets in one session, then I would definitely turn that dial down in terms of taking more sets further away from failure for the bicep. But because I'm doing so little per day, I can get away with taking most of my sets pretty close to failure.
Yeah, it makes sense. Again, it's more of a volume issue for you, especially for the bicep, than it is actually like the intensity of what you're doing there. So
Yeah.
cool, man. Love just hearing about training and just what people do there for that. And a lot of times it does end up being, hey, I just want to try to get as jacked as I can. And as you said, stay injury free as well too there with that. And I'm sure again, like all the stuff you're researching too probably has helped transform your training as well too over time. Yeah, looking for let's chat about your some of your studies here that you've recently done and been a part of. So this first one, and I feel like this one got a lot of air on social media, was your hip thrust and back squatting. The title is Hip Thrust and Back Squatting Elicit Similar Gluteus Muscle Hypertrophy and Transfer Similarly to the Deadlift. Yeah, really cool study. I'm curious to hear what you guys were looking at and maybe just the summary of what you guys found, and then I have a few kind of follow-up questions to that there.
Yeah, so we took untrained individuals and we split them into either a squat group or a hip thrust group. So one group was only squatting, the other group was only hip thrusting. And we did this for 9 weeks and we had a sort of a ramp up sets. So because they're untrained individuals, I didn't want to hammer them in the beginning. So we started at 3 sets per week for 2 weeks, and then we ramped up slowly up to 6 sets for the last 2 weeks. So pretty moderate to low volumes actually for most of the duration because it was 2 times per week. So they ended at 12 sets per week, either of squats and hip thrusts, and that was the only exercise they were doing. And we did EMG at the upper, mid, and lower region for the first testing session, and we measured their quad and glute hypertrophy using MRI pre and post. And we found that it was pretty interesting. There's a lot of cool findings that you can piece together how you want to train. So for glutes, there was no difference in hypertrophy. So it seems to point toward the fact that squats are a pretty good hammer in that they hit a whole lot of muscle groups at the same time. So even though there weren't any meaningful differences in glute hypertrophy, the quads and adductors did grow more with the squat. We also found that the upper and middle glute grew less than the lower glute for both groups. So what that kind of suggests is that those hip extension type exercises may be a little bit more biased toward that lower glute, and doing a bit more abduction work where your leg is going out may be more specific to that upper glute region. So that's a sort of cool practical takeaway. And then we corroborated the fact that hamstrings don't really grow from either of those exercises. We knew for a while that the hamstrings didn't grow from the squat. We didn't know for the hip thrust, and a lot of people claim that they were feeling their hamstring in the hip thrust in terms of just like out in the wild. But what they're probably feeling is the adductor and not the glute, or they're potentially doing it wrong in that their
Yeah.
like legs are straight and they're doing hamstring-esque thrust, which is definitely not recommended if you're trying to hit the glute.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's awesome. So what, so squats, just real quick. So squats,
Yep.
you guys found the quads, but it was also just pretty much is what, like you said, no meaningful difference between squats and hip thrusts in terms of
Glute
glute growth,
hypertrophy.
high hypertrophy there with that.
Yeah.
What was the squat? How were the squats done? Were those like high bar, or what was the technique like there with that?
Yes, because they were untrained individuals, we tried to give some wiggle room. And I knew that no matter how you programmed it, it wouldn't please everyone. So if you did a low bar, it's all right, why didn't you use an RDL? And when we initially came up with the study, it was actually going to be an RDL and a lunge versus a hip thrust and a 45-degree hyper. So getting at a little bit more of that versus shortened question, but it turned into a more popular question because we were trying to replicate another study where we were doing a more fun question, which is squat versus hip thrust. So for the squat form, we had people go as deep as they could, and every single session, especially with untrained individuals, like deeper, deeper, just try to. So it ended up being that so one individual who was super tall was doing all of his sets at like pretty far above parallel. Everyone else was very close to parallel, at parallel, or ass to grass. So there were about four individuals that were hamstring on calf, and about six individuals that were perfectly at parallel. Maybe one or two that like maybe were like a millimeter or two above parallel, and one really tall dude that was just like probably a good 30 degrees above parallel, mostly high bar, actually pretty much all sort of high bar mid-range position. And they look good pretty early on in terms of their form. So it's not something where I was like, oh, these are really ugly squats. I was actually, I mean, I've been coaching the squat for a decent while and have many cues and tricks that try to make it as simple as possible. Just sit back down onto the chair early on. I wasn't super surprised, but I was happy with their form pretty early on. So yeah, it was pretty cool to help people along the way. That's one benefit of actually using untrained individuals. You get to teach a whole bunch of
Yeah.
people, get them addicted to exercise, hopefully.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Again, like this is something that I feel like just reading the paper, you wouldn't really understand that you have to do some of that coaching in these studies. And again, having somebody that knows how to coach people to do that can really make a big difference there. So for the guy that squatted and he didn't reach parallel, did that change anything there with that?
Yeah, so there's always issues with using individual data points, but I, for fun, because people kept asking me this, looked into this, and the people who quote unquote were squatting the highest grew equal, if not more, than the people that were squatting lower. So I don't think that you can take that home with you because the study's not powered to
Right.
actually answer that question in terms of it's 16 people. So if you subdivide one person alone, it could have been that he was just more likely to grow, period, right? We don't know if his twin would have grew more. And so if you have enough people, and then you create those sort of normal distributions, then you can start comparing between groups. So because we're comparing within a group, it's a lot harder to draw these conclusions, but you can draw some soft conclusions. If you saw something super obvious in one direction, like it mattered night and day, then we might even be able to see this with this small group because the magnitude of effect matters. But yeah, just in terms of exploratory stuff, it seemed so he actually grew, I think, the second most out of everyone in the study. I'm definitely not confident at all that the depth, especially from parallel to a few inches under, really matters for glute hypertrophy. There's tons of mechanical things that you can speculate on, but nobody really knows whether that difference. There's a whole lot of stuff going on, including the fact that you're like pretty much literally sitting on the hamstring. So what's going on in terms of activation there? Is it like a quasi pause? There's a lot of things that are not obvious at all that many people ran away with when they were interpreting like, oh, if they didn't go ass to grass, then it's not hypertrophic at all, or drawing way too lazy speculative stuff is probably not the best idea. And then other people who are, oh, ass to grass is ridiculous, that's only quad, they should have done good morning-esque RDL-esque squats and that would have been better. And another group of people that wanted sumo squats and so on. Lots and lots of speculation. And honestly, we don't really know. And those would be cool studies. But I'm very skeptical of the fact that 1 inch or two in a squat from parallel or slightly below parallel to truly ass to grass would matter a whole lot for specifically for glute hypertrophy.
As you were saying that, I'm thinking, well, again, you guys found that the squats were very similar to the hip thrust. So it's like, what would the difference be if you did change that technique to make it more posterior chain loaded? Would that even, it's like it was already, you guys found that the differences weren't very different anyway. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense what I'm trying to say there.
Yeah, I think I get what you're trying to say. I think, and this is a valid question in that if there is a stretch mediated effect and you're
Gotcha.
trying to maximize that stretch mediated effect, then there is a depth that would matter. But the interesting part of the stretch or long length research is that we don't know how long is. So every single study compared shorter versus longer muscle lengths, not the longest muscle length possible. So even in, let's say, the Meow study with the hamstring, when you sit on a seated hamstring curl, that's not the most stretch your hamstring could be. You could lean forward and get
Or
way more of a stretch in the hamstring. So whether leaning forward 1 inch and getting a really good stretch and doing the set, or leaning forward another inch and screaming, or another inch and being really uncomfortable matters for hypertrophy is obviously an open question. And I would venture to guess that last inch where you're uncomfortable is probably not worth it at all. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot of unanswered questions on that front.
yeah, it's almost to the point where it's like, hey, stretch media hypertrophy is good, but it's okay. At what point is it like, hey, now it's too much, and then it's not going to be better at that point? Because again, I feel like a lot of times in fitness, and I'm sure you've seen this too in nutrition, where it's like, oh, so it's better, like protein's better, so then I should just have the most amount of protein ever, and it's okay. That's not necessarily the case, right? Like you don't. It's there's going to be that Goldilocks zone, I guess, there with it. So, and then hip extension. So you guys found that again, like the hip extension movements. Do you think that any of these would translate over to again, so squats, like a leg press to like a leg press? And do you think any variation of a hip extension, or do you think that again, you can't really draw the conclusion from that because you specifically just did these exercises, or can you speculate on that? Or yeah.
Yeah. I think one thing that I didn't mention that's useful from the hypertrophy standpoint is that the hip thrust was a lot more specific to the glute. And many people, especially women, don't want to grow their quads more. They're happy with their quad growth and want more specific glute growth. So that's one practical takeaway I forgot to mention. But yeah, on the strength end of things, it's really hard to make strong conclusions from this study because I think on the strength side of things, it is a little bit harder to draw conclusions with untrained individuals. Like their deadlift was not as pretty and locked in as I would have wanted it to be in order to draw like really strong conclusions for trained lifters. But it is a very interesting finding. How it would translate to other things probably matters a lot with how the specific lifter does things, what's limiting the lifter. So is it the low back? Is it the glute? Is it the quad? What specific thing are they trying to work on? So yeah, it's really hard to make those claims, but it's cool that the hip thrust is a pretty low fatigue exercise where if glute hypertrophy is your goal or even strength is your goal, getting it in to your cycle for a period of time and then seeing how that changes things is probably not a bad idea in terms of experimentation.
And I'm sure too that like part of this wasn't necessarily like you guys were trying to pin the hip thrust versus the squat. It was just like, if anything, it just shows that you have some flexibility with it, or I guess it just can help you determine what exercises to choose and for what when it comes to hypertrophy.
Yeah, the goal is never to really pin exercises against each other. It's to use exercises in order to try to get at principles that we can then apply to training. So here we can get at tons of things in terms of realizing, okay, which regions are more, which thing is more of a hammer versus more precise. How can I think about the biomechanics of, okay, extension versus abduction? If lower glute is more built during extension, then I can do more abduction exercises. And then later studies can add on to this. These are like the initial studies, but a later study can do, for example, more thrusting actions and see whether you can recover better from that or a combination of abduction and extension and whether that would grow more than like a single leg work. So there's a whole bunch of questions that would be layered on that are probably more applicable to a whole program type thing versus here we're trying to use exercises in order to get at principles and apply those principles to a training program. I would never prescribe only one exercise or the other to an actual individual.
And this may go into some of that. So my next question on this was any like misinterpretations. I know I'm pretty sure as I was looking that was this was out on preprint, right? So you were probably able to get some feedback on the study and then redo it a little bit. Was there any misinterpretations that you saw going around with the study or anything like that?
Any study that comes out, you're definitely going to get a whole bunch of. There are some people claiming that we measured their glute with MRI. I want to say Wednesday was the last training session, and we measured on Saturday. So 4 days after their last bout, and people were claiming that the amount of swelling from the stretch mediated hypertrophy in the squat would affect the MRI outcomes in people that were doing 12 sets per week and were slowly ramping up starting at 6 sets per week. Like that just seems absurd to me, honestly. So they were basically making the claim that the hip thrust could have been better because of the fact that there was still swelling. And then people on the other side of the spectrum, which I mentioned, talking about how if you're not going ass to grass, it's not the most stimulus and pretty much everything in between in terms of making really strong claims about what we can say about trained versus untrained individuals. There's probably every interpretation that you can think of because there was a decent amount of popularity and the fact that Brett Contreras was involved. So I got The ones that I hated the most were definitely the ones that were poking at my integrity in terms of, oh, Brett funded this study, so therefore the results can pretty much be thrown out completely, where he had like literally no hand in anything that really went on day to day. So, and Menno Henselman's also funded the study, and he really doesn't have a dog in the race. And the funniest part is that the outcome didn't benefit Brett at all. Like he
Right.
was super staunch on the fact that the hip thrust was going to be superior. He was texting me throughout the whole study, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm not sure." So yeah, it's just crazy the kind of theories people come up with.
Like you said, it wasn't, that was like, if anything, the hip thrust, again, the squats showed that the glutes. So it's just, again, that it didn't necessarily like help him out
For sure.
from that standpoint. I guess to wrap up, is there any on this study in particular, is there any like potential like limitations that people know about? And then maybe do you want to just wrap up any other practical applications or anything we potentially missed going over the study or anything like that?
I think we covered most of the big rocks there. Yeah.
Cool. I guess at this point, my final question on this before I move on, any questions that left you asking or anything like that moving forward with this particular topic?
Yeah, one thing that is interesting and helps people when it comes to interpreting studies is that a lot of the time you can interpret studies in light of other evidence that comes out. So you can say, all right, we're not really sure what's going on here. We're going to be cautious. And then another study comes out and you're like, okay, you can interpret this maybe a bit differently. So this study hasn't been published yet. So I'm still, in the I'm not sure camp. But another study from Meow and colleagues compared essentially a multi-hip exercise where they were doing kickbacks with partial range of motion at the stretch position for the glute versus a full range of motion. And that partial range of motion produced more hypertrophy in the glute. So, in light of that finding, if that finding ends up being published, I'm not sure what's going on. It's been a little bit, so I'm sure it should be published soon. That in light of that finding, you could say, okay, maybe, and this is still a maybe, what's going on is that even though the squat has a whole bunch of muscle groups that are at play while the hip thrust is more isolated, the fact that the glute is in that more stretch position in the squat, it's getting enough of a tension slash stretch stimulus that it accounts for the fact that it's not the main limiter in the squat, and it could have been that the quad is actually the main limiter and the glute is a bit or a decent bit away from failure, but gets enough of a stimulus because of that stretch mediated effect. So I'm always trying to answer the question of like, all right, which muscles are actually reacting to this specific stimuli and how can we put this all together? So that's one thing that I'm interested in and I want to see more research on is one, which muscles actually get to the descending limb, like which muscles are actually receiving passive tension. Because it seems like some muscles that you wouldn't think get to that passive tension portion just based on some of the mechanistic evidence are still getting that stretch mediated hypertrophy benefit. So the reason for the stretch mediated hypertrophy is still fairly up in the air. So I'm interested in which muscles do grow and what's happening at the actual sarcomere level in order to try to get at, all right, how can we start drawing conclusions for things that we haven't tested directly? Because that's obviously the goal. We don't want to have to do a randomized controlled trial for every single muscle and every single context. We want to be able to create principles and heuristics that we can start at least applying with some level of confidence. Yeah, I'd definitely like to see some more studies looking at different muscle groups and how they react to different muscle lengths, and also mechanistic studies looking at what's actually going on at the sarcomere level. So there's some pretty cool micro needle microscopes that can actually measure where the sarcomere is in space during a contraction. Pairing those together would be, unfortunately, that's like $1 million+ a piece of equipment, I think, or something like that. So we don't have access to it, but other labs do. So hopefully they care about these questions that us meatheads care about. Luckily, there's other applications too. So yeah, I'm hoping to see some of that stuff.
Yeah, and in my understanding, the glutes, there's not any, and I think the Maya one that you're talking about is the one that I think started to be like, hey, there is now some research potentially on the stretch mediated hypertrophy for the glute specifically, because my understanding there isn't any for the glutes as of right
Yeah,
now.
that's literally the only one that was actually trying to isolate that question was that study, which isn't even published. It was a poster presentation
Yeah.
at a conference. So there was one other study that compared like very short range of motion squats, so like 45-degree squats versus 90-degree squat. And so that one doesn't really get at the question of long muscle lengths because what those squats look like. It could have been super quad dominant and so on. So yeah, the really just one study that's actually getting at that question. And even then, I think we could probably have better design. So that one, they used a straight leg hip extension on the multi hip. They could have done like a bent leg to a kickback type thing to make the hamstring less involved there. I think it still does a pretty decent job of answering the question because both of them were straight legs, so you're equating for that. But I think we could probably do an even better job potentially. So that's why studies always beget other studies. But yeah,
Yep.
very limited evidence
Yep. For the glutes specifically,
for the
right? Is that what
glutes.
yeah,
Yeah,
glutes.
yeah,
Okay.
that's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Is I guess while we're on the topic of this real quick before we dive into the next one, is there anything on what are is it still the same kind of muscle groups? I know the calves. There is some on the tricep too.
Yeah, so the same group, the Meow group, did an overhead tricep study
Okay.
versus a regular tricep extension study. So overhead versus regular tricep push down, and they found more growth in the overhead tricep than they did in the tricep push down. Yep. And then the
Okay.
bicep, the like 3 or 4 studies now on the bicep. So I think those are the main muscle groups. Yeah, the calf, the bicep, the tricep, and some evidence in the quad. Actually, a decent amount of evidence in the
That's
quad,
right. Yeah, it's
particularly
quads.
in the distal portion. So yeah, I think those are oh, and the hamstring. So a good amount of muscle groups. Less evidence in the hamstring. I think it's 2 studies, but one pretty strong study with the Meow study in the seated hamstring curl versus the lying hamstring curl. So, especially when it comes to two joint muscles, it seems pretty clear you want to put that muscle in the stretch position. If that makes sense. So, you can, within a range of motion, make the exercise harder in the more lengthened position. So, even for, let's say, a tricep push down, because the long head of the tricep crosses the shoulder, in order to get the most stretch out of the tricep, you would put that arm above your head, right? But you can make the lengthened position of a tricep push down harder depending on where you put the cable and so on. So a lot of it is a question of, all right, is it more about making the exercise harder in the more lengthened position or putting the muscle into the most lengthened position and then making the exercise harder there? So you have to piece that puzzle together. But what the evidence is showing, at least with the limited evidence we have, is that they're both important. So you would want to put the muscle in at least a more stretch position in terms of like overhead for the tricep, seated position for the hamstring, and so on. But you also want to make even that exercise at least a little bit more biased toward that lengthened position. So if you skimp out too much on either end, then you're probably going to miss out on some gains, at least on a set per set basis. So basically, if you did a seated hamstring curl where the strength curve was such that it was only hard at that shortened position, you'd probably miss out on some gains if I had to guess, just based on the evidence I've seen. Because they did do one study in the bicep where
Bicep. Yep.
yeah, where they did the incline bench curls. And that is the more stretch position for the bicep because the bicep crosses the shoulder. But because it's not hard at all in that bottom position, the preacher curl actually allowed for more growth. So the preacher curl is harder in the more lengthened position, but the muscle is not in its most lengthened position because of the fact that it crosses the shoulder. So yeah, you want to get both, cover both of those bases in order to get the most benefit likely.
Yeah. So again, it's two different things going on there. Again, you want to get in that lengthened position, but also you want to try to find a way. You can try to find a way to make it tougher in that lengthened position as well too, and that's going to be or try to make it
Yeah, you're
like
right.
okay, just
Yeah,
making sure
so
on that.
yeah, they're both the lengthened positions, so that's why it gets a little confusing. But yeah,
Yeah.
so when you think about the position, you want to put the muscle in a position where it's more lengthened, so it's getting more stretch. But then you also, within the range of motion of the exercise, want the hardest part of that range of motion to be in a more stretch position. So one is where is the exercise difficult, and the other is where is the exercise actually occurring in terms of what the actual joint is doing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sometimes in this, like, it gets weight length in this, but yeah, no,
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
that
we
makes,
should use different terms for sure.
no, that makes sense though. Appreciate you summing that up. So let's go to the next study here. Let me pull it up so I can get the title down. And I think you were the lead author on this one too. So progressive overload without progressing load, the effects of load or repetition progression on muscular adaptations. And I wanted to bring this one up. And I actually made a couple posts on this at one point, and this one always gets like a really good, like a lot of saves and like just a lot more like people just I think like this topic. And so I wanted to bring it up to actually talk to you about it to see. But yeah, I'm just curious again, what were you guys like, kind of what was the point of it and what were you guys looking at and why? And then what did you find there with it?
Yeah, so I'm really proud of that title. I thought it was clever. That was really my only contribution to science, just that beautiful title. Everything else just complete
Hey,
crap.
the
So
title's the most important. That's what gets
yeah.
people to read it.
Yeah, Brad actually, Dr. Schoenfeld really harps on that. You really want to convey a message and get people to, because part of being a scientist in an applied science is actually getting people to
To
be
read it.
engaged. So yeah, we took this time trained individuals and we wanted to see whether progressing in reps or progressing in load would produce better hypertrophy. So better hypertrophy, better strength. And we also actually even did an endurance event as well. So a leg extension with 60% of their body weight. So the design of the study is we tested their 10 rep max. And then after we tested their 10 rep max, the reps group stayed at that same load throughout the whole study and only progressed in reps. So they did as many reps as they could. So to form failure, all of their sets. While the load group, we tried to keep in the 8 to 12 rep range and really trying to get at near that 10 number. So one group only progressed in reps. So week to week, they would try to get another rep with that same load that they started with their 10 RM, while the other group week to week was trying to add a bit of load as their strength allowed. So what we found was, and this is becoming a theme, there were no differences between groups. So it didn't matter whether you progressed in reps or progressed in load for hypertrophy. There was a slight benefit to progressing in load for strength, and that kind of makes sense because it's specific to the adaptation. What's interesting is that if they had some sort of practice with heavier loads, would that have been the case? I'm not so sure. Meaning, let's say they were every couple of weeks, they were doing like a 3 RM or something like that. Maybe it would have been a different outcome. So that's something I always try to think about in terms of how little strength work do you need in order to actually get all of that benefit. And then, do you want to talk about the muscle endurance aspect of it? Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can hit on that.
So for muscle endurance, there were no differences between groups either. And this was somewhat surprising to people, but I think not super surprising if you think about the adaptations that are probably the most important for muscle endurance, which, especially at a relatively low to moderate load, not super low load, it's probably going to be strength. So if you're trying to get better at doing 20 reps of an exercise, if you get stronger, you're going to be able to do more reps. That's just up until for a really long time. So when you get to the point of diminishing returns, is probably when you're so strong that thing is just like super easy. Let's say you can do 1,000, let's say you're trying to do like a thousand pull-ups or something like that, then yeah, you probably want to get some of that higher rep work in because there's different things going on with like metabolic stress and being able to tolerate the discomfort and so on. But within a reasonable amounts of, basically, if it's fairly close to the strength level where you could benefit more from just being stronger, I'd probably focus on that more than I focused on doing very specific work at the rep range that you're trying to get better at. It's very similar to any other adaptation, like even let's say like mile training. So training for the mile run, you don't want to go out and do a mile every single time you train. You want to do a combination of sprints in order to increase your efficiency, ground contact, all that kind of stuff. You want to do a lot of longer runs in order to increase your aerobic engine, increase your VO2 max, lactate threshold, all that kind of stuff. So there's adaptations that I call it adaptive specificity, where it's specific to the adaptations that will lend themselves to what you want specifically, as opposed to doing that specific thing over and over again, which honestly, sometimes doing that can shoot you in the foot.
Like another one that kind of comes to mind as you were saying that was like if you want to improve your one rep max on like bench press or something, you're not just going to go in and just hit your one rep max every single. Well, you can do that, but that's probably not going to lead to the best one rep max there on that. So I thought that was a great example that you
For
had
sure.
there. How high, and maybe you mentioned this, but how high did the reps get for these people that were just increasing reps? Or was it, hey, it was in the 8 to 12? Because I heard 8 to 12. And then once they got to the top end, did you increase load or they literally just increase reps the entire throughout?
Yeah, so the load group tried to stay within the 8 to 12 rep
Okay.
range, and then we adjusted load. The reps group kept going in reps, and we never adjusted the load. So the average reps were between 10 to 20 at the end of the study.
Okay.
But the average can sometimes be a little misleading because of the fact that the average is over the 4 sets that they did in that session. So that means that, and this typically happens with very high reps, their first set could have been like 28, and their next set was 22, and their next set was 18, and the next set was 12. That was the average for the reps group in their last session. For isolation exercises, the average was a bit higher, closer to 20 reps or so for their last session. And then for the compound exercises, which was the squat, that was a bit lower, would average about 16 or 15 for the last session. Yeah. While the obviously the load group was still sticking to that 10 rep number and just increased their load throughout.
And then as far as again training intensity, and when I say training intensity, how close they got to failure, was that was monitored, you said, and everything like that, or was it just, hey, the goal is to add load and add reps, and we're not really going to be focused on the training intensity?
Oh, we definitely wanted to standardize the training intensity. So the only time we added load or reps was when so for reps, they did as many as so they modulated that
Okay.
in that they took sets to form failure where they believed that the next rep would be a very ugly rep. So volitional failure is what we call that. So the reps group, with our encouragement, of course, in terms of we were telling to keep going and so on, the reps group stopped when they believed that they couldn't do another clean rep. The load group, if they ever left the 12 rep range, so they also took all of their sets to volitional failure. And let's say that individual did 13 reps, then I would increase the load, put a 2.5 on each side and make sure that as many of their sets as possible was close to 10. Even if they hit that 12, actually, let's say you saw over time that individual was pretty good at keeping the amount of reps they did, even with the 2 minute rest period, then I would probably still increase load. That way you could just progress and keep with the theme of the study where like we're really trying to progress load in these people. If he hits 12, 12, 12, 10 one session, I'm probably still going to go up next session, even though he didn't leave the 8 to 12 rep range. It'll be like 5 pounds higher and so on. So
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess what kind of sparked you guys to want to look at this? Was there anything, was there not much in the area of this research? Was there maybe some myths that you saw out there or heard around this?
yeah, it's interesting because one of the most common, I wouldn't say misinterpretations, but one thing that people miss with the study is that it's a high rep, so like a high load versus low load study. We do have a good amount of evidence that high loads and low loads produce similar amounts of hypertrophy, but that's a much different question than the question that we're asking because we're talking about on a session to session basis, which variable can we manipulate in order to get the most out of the session, and will that turn into the most growth? And my hypothesis going in was that if there was going to be something that was more beneficial, it would be the thing that's the most sensitive. So the thing that you can change a tiny bit and make it be in line with your performance. So to me, that was load, where I can go in one session and do 10 reps. And the next session to failure, let's say, the next session I go in, there's no way that I'm going to do 11 reps, right? If I've already been training that exercise for a while. But can I add a pound on each side? Probably, right? So the specificity of being able to make basically an infinite amount of changes with load, if you have the plates available, allows you to keep with adaptations, but The interesting part is, and the reason why I was very skeptical of whether that would matter, is that does that sensitivity matter on a physiological level? And the answer seems to be no. So maybe you can get exactly the amount that individual can do on that session, but there's probably a range where once you hit that threshold, it doesn't really matter that you top that out completely. So over time, it washes out. And maybe if we did a 5 year study, then there'd be a different outcome. I highly doubt it, because I do think that there's that range where once you tick the main boxes, getting the absolute most out of XYZ is probably not necessary. Just make sure you reach those thresholds and create the best combination for yourself for that session in order to string together the best sessions over time.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times too, and maybe this was sparked too, but like I think a lot of people think the only way you can progress from a muscle building standpoint is by adding load. So I feel like it also helped dispel that myth where it's okay, you can get away with adding reps, and that's a totally fine way to progress. So you don't always have to add more load, which I feel like sometimes I've been there where you chase a logbook and you start adding weight, and then that can lead to your execution go down, your technique starts to dwindle a little bit as well too there.
Yeah, that's why we named it like that. Yeah, that's a really good point, and obviously a big part of why it's in the name. So progressive overload. So people assume that we're talking about load when we mean overload, but we're really talking about physiological overload. So creating a stimulus that warrants adaptation. And interestingly, people misinterpret it in a couple of ways. One, they misinterpret it in assuming that load needs to be adjusted. But two, they sometimes misinterpret it as anything needs to be adjusted, in
Yep.
that you can do the same exact thing the next session, and that could be enough of a stimulus, so enough of an overload in order to perturb your system in order to create growth. Over time, over a larger amount of time, you definitely want to make adjustments and keep in that range of creating the necessary perturbation. But you definitely don't need to every single session, like you said, like I'm guilty of this. I'm sure tons of people have been obsessed with this or guilty of this, where like I would try to beat the logbook at any cost. Like it was clear that my form was not the same exact as the week, and that's okay. It's not a big deal, but a lot of the time you're putting unnecessary stress on yourself. Sometimes not the physical aspect is not even the most important part there, because like I think bodies are resilient and stuff like that. I think psychologically it was a lot just going to the
Yep.
gym thinking that every single time I need to beat the logbook. So yeah, I think taking that stress off yourself can definitely be an unlock in your training.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up too, because like you said, I just literally had this conversation with my coach this last week too about I find that I tell people not to do this, but I end up doing it too, where I end up trying to just chase the logbook. And I feel like probably short term that doesn't become an issue, but I feel like probably over multiple sessions you start to do that's where it starts to add up, and you're towards the end of a mesocycle, and it's man now your heaviest weights, your technique suffer, and that's where it starts to add up there with that. So it's probably not short term, but I'm also glad that you brought up the fact that hey, like this again was to show that if you are going to make change, you can do either, but you also don't necessarily have to do that every single session either. You can overload by still doing the same thing from week to week, but over time, you want to make sure that you're making some form of progression, and we have options there with that. Was there any other misinterpretations, limitations, or anything? And if not, is it, you just want to maybe wrap up again the practical applications on this again one more time?
Yeah, so I think a good practical takeaway is that we compared one specific thing, and the fact that we found that it didn't really matter doesn't mean that you should go out and do an only rep style progression, because it can be more uncomfortable, particularly for certain exercises. So I can tell you that in the squat group, doing 28 reps on the first set, it was not fun, right? I think practically speaking, choosing exercises that lend themselves well to a specific rep range is probably a really good idea. Even though it may produce the same amount of muscle size, if it's more comfortable to produce the same amount of muscle size at a different rep range, I'd choose that. And just theoretically speaking, maybe if it was a longer study and it was a squat only study, there would have been a slightly different outcome, in that the moderate rep range would have edged out the higher rep range for the squat specifically. That's obviously speculation, but we do have some data that in the 50 or so rep range, it's not as hypertrophic. So I think Jesse et al. Showed that in, I think, the bicep. So you can definitely reach a rep number that's too high or too low of a load. That's one thing. Two, choose an exercise that lends itself to a specific rep range. And I think a good way of doing that allows you to cover a lot of bases is having a double progression model for different exercises. So I'll have some exercises in the 5 to 8 rep range. Usually those are like compound exercises where many times, sometimes cardiovascular system, sometimes a different muscle will limit you. So, for example, in an RDL, if I do really high rep RDL, sometimes I'll feel it more in my lower back than I do in my hamstring and glute. So, staying in that 5 to 8 rep range for something like an RDL, maybe a squat, 5 to 10, and so on, is a good idea. Then I have another set of exercises where I keep in the 8 to 12 rep range and I recycle once I get out of that 12 rep range. And then I have another group where I do 12 to 15 and recycle there. And a few muscles also that I'll do in the 15 to 20 rep range as well. So choose the rep range for the specific exercise that you enjoy and then stay within that rep range. So once you reach the top and you're beating that rep number, increase the load and recycle back down and keep going ad nauseum.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much how it is, right? To build muscle, right? Just keep going, rinse and repeat. Yeah, and what I liked about this too is it made me feel better about prescribing like more so rep ranges versus like an exact rep as well too, like you mentioned there. So again, like you said, like working like a rep range of 8 to 12. And hey, if you're at the bottom end, just maybe that week you're trying to just add reps. And then once you get to like you said, 12, then it's okay, maybe now it's time to add load or something like that. But I also like that you brought up the point too. Hey, pay attention to the exercises that you're utilizing too. That's obviously going to play a role. Like you said, RDLs, that's not going to be one that you probably want to go the 10 to 15 rep range and keep adding reps there. You're probably going to want to focus more on adding weight there. Cool. Yeah, I thought that was a really cool study. And again, I think it can be really helpful in terms of programming for clients and how to go about your training there with that. So we're about 12 after. Do you want to maybe briefly touch on the rep ranges? I know you just did there a little bit, hinted at that. So I think it'd be cool to just briefly touch on this and what you guys were looking at and just, yeah, go there and then we can wrap up the conversation.
Yeah, so I was part of a review paper that sort of reviewed the rep continuum, so to speak, in that lower rep ranges are more conducive to strength, moderate rep ranges are more conducive to, and very high rep ranges are conducive to endurance. While it seems like a lot of that is very up in the air. So going one by one, it seems like you can grow very well and equally from between 5 and 30 reps for a hypertrophy, from a hypertrophy standpoint. Going well below, so going below 5 is probably not a good idea because there's some evidence you need to do more sets in order to get the same outcome below 5. And there's potentially also just like focus, stability, and joint issues that come with doing tons of sets at like 2. And for the very high end of things, so very low loads, well above 30, we spoke about briefly that the load is just not high enough to potentially recruit those high threshold motor units. So even when you create that sort of fatigue. So hypertrophy rep range, definitely not only the moderate rep range, even though being in that moderate rep range, you're not, missing out on much, but having that level of variation for specific exercises allows you to make those modifications if you need them for a specific person, a specific exercise. So it's a nice thing that we have that range there. From a strength standpoint, I think specificity in that realm does matter, but I don't think you should spend too much time in those very low rep ranges because one, the foundation of strength is hypertrophy. So spending a bit of time at that 8 to 12 rep range is definitely going to beget strength benefits, but also just hammering that same pattern in that low rep range can sometimes create issues as well. So I think a combination of low and moderate is probably a good idea from a strength standpoint. And for the endurance aspect of things, I think that the foundation of endurance is strength. So making sure that your strength is up to par in order to do that muscular endurance event is a really good idea, while of course getting some specific practice at that level of muscular endurance would be a good idea. And obviously you modulate depending on how close it is. So let's say you're trying to get really good at bench pressing 225 for 30 and you currently bench press 225 for 5. your main goal should be getting stronger, not doing 165 for 30 reps. There's a huge disparity before you can start attacking those endurance ranges.
Yeah, cool. I love that you guys looked over, like, again, not just hypertrophy, you also looked at endurance and strength as well, too. I want to stick to the hypertrophy side of things here for my next couple questions. What would you, so you hit on this, the downsides of the lower rep ranges. If I remember correctly, I guess some of that research, Brad did a study, right, where they looked at like moderate volume and then, or it was like 3 by 10 versus 10 by 3 or something like that, wasn't it? Something like that. And they found
Yeah.
that basically the big thing was that those people that did the 10 by 3, so they did 10 sets of three, they just were like felt more beat up and like had a, I could be making this up, higher dropout rate or something like that as well. And that kind of lend to that thought that, hey, that is not going to be great from a hypertrophy standpoint there with that.
Yeah, so it was you were very close. It was 3 by 7.
Oh,
So
3 by 7. Okay.
yeah, so they did 7 sets, three reps, and the other group did 3 by 10. So they did more than double the sets. And so the the groups grew the same, so there was no difference in hypertrophy, but one group was doing way more sets, so 7 sets versus 3 sets. Sorry, 7 by 3. Did I say 3 by 7? Yeah, 7 by 3.
7 by 7.
So the group did more sets, got the same amount of hypertrophy. So that's one of the few studies that lends itself to the fact that once you're below 5, you may not be accumulating enough time under tension per set in order to maximize those benefits. So I think I tentatively say it because I'm pretty sure that's literally the only study that actually compared those head to head. But because of exactly what you said, there were slightly more dropouts, but definitely more complaining in that group. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do most of your sets under 5 from a just a joint standpoint. A lot of them were comparing of or complaining of joint pain and just the amount of focus you need when
Yeah.
you unrack 3RM is much, much different than when you unrack something for 10, where the initial kind of reps are not like gonna kill you if you lose your focus for a second. So I
So like
think
even,
it's definitely a
go
good
ahead.
rule of thumb. Yeah.
Sorry. The like mentally it can weigh on you, time components, like now you're got to dedicate more time to it. And then again, anecdotally speaking, forget like just doing that, like that type of training, that many sets, like, that would definitely put a lot of wear and tear on the joints over long term, and probably not something that somebody is going to be able to do long term. There is there any would there be any other downsides of kind of training in that lower rep range for hypertrophy or anything like that?
Other than like psychology, potentially joints, and just having to do more sets, nothing comes to mind.
Yeah, I just didn't know if there was anything else. And then the higher rep ranges, right? You hit on a few things there. What are the downsides of the higher rep ranges? I would say what, probably 15, 20 plus there with that for
Yeah.
hypertrophy.
I think 15 to 20, depending on the exercise, is probably okay. Like a lateral raise for 15 or a bicep curl for 15 is totally cool. Once you get to that like 25 range, we have some evidence that getting to failure. So one, people gauging failure is a bit harder in that range. So that's a huge downside. If you're not sure that you're 1 or 2 reps away from failure, then you're not sure that you're getting the most out of each set. Two is that it seems like the limited evidence we have points toward the fact that you may actually need to take sets closer to failure at those higher rep ranges in order to get all of the benefit. While you could be, for example, 3 or even 4 reps in reserve on moderate to lower rep range, for those higher rep ranges, it seems like getting closer to failure is necessary in order to maximize. They still definitely grow, take this, but to maximize the benefit, it seems like you do need to take the set closer to failure. And then once you get into the way too high rep ranges, then even if you're taking a set to failure, you're not going to get the same amount of growth. So proximity to failure, gauging it a bit harder, actually having to take the set closer to failure, which obviously comes with some downside, particularly for certain exercises, and the sort of downside of the fact that if you go way too high, then you're for sure leaving some gains on the table.
And I don't know how you feel about this, but that type of training I feel like just sucks as well
Oh
too.
yeah, I
Like
was yeah, like that's just like I think it goes hand in hand with
yeah.
like the harder to gauge and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it is not comfortable for the vast majority of exercises. So I don't do any 20 is the highest I go just because there just isn't much of an upside for pretty much anything in order to tolerate that discomfort.
And that's a good point, right? Like obviously that they go hand in hand there with it. Well, would there be any application of using that higher rep range? Hey, I would be more likely to use it for this person in this situation or anything like that.
Yeah, I think injuries, like when people feel some sort of discomfort, not, I wouldn't say an acute injury or anything like that, but when people feel joint discomfort, playing around with that higher rep range is sometimes helpful. I know for certain overhead tricep exercises, if I go too heavy, I start feeling it in my joint. But if I do like a 15 or so, it feels fine. I have no idea why that's happening, but I'll take it. So I think from that standpoint is really the only time where I try to make sure that person stays in that rep range so they don't have those issues. But I think also from a theoretical standpoint, it goes back to the sort of mechanism thing because there's so much stuff we don't know. It's possible that there may be different inputs at the higher rep range versus the moderate versus the kind of lower-ish rep range, where if it's not a lot of skin off my back for the particular exercise, I'll play around with it for sure. So I'll have an exercise in a few rep ranges and oscillate those just so I'm covering my bases. And also from a psychological standpoint, we talked about beating the logbook, having the exercise in twice and having a different rep range for the exercise makes it a lot more, what's the right word? A lot more pleasing week to week when I actually increase in one of those per week. And it also, because I'm seeing it twice per week, makes it more likely that I'm increasing as well. So I can feel better about myself week to week when I have those two rep ranges. When if I just hit it 8 to 12 and then 2 or 3 days later I'm hitting it 8 to 12 again, the likelihood that I beat that is probably pretty slim. But on a week to week basis, one of those may go up, and definitely like on a 2 week, 3 week basis, one of them is going to start progressing. So I like it from a psychological standpoint and some speculative mechanistic stuff standpoint.
Yeah, just like you said, there might be some special benefit to doing certain rep ranges. Again, we don't know for sure, but
Yeah.
potentially there with that. So, like you said, check your boxes there with that. And again, like you said, just again, psychologically, just doing different rep ranges too can be helpful. Cool, man. Great summary of everything. Two final questions. One, do you have anything, any like big studies coming out here in the next little bit that you can talk about, not talk about, but just let us know about that are coming out? And then lastly, where can people find you?
Yeah, so on the practical hypertrophy side of things, not a whole lot coming out in the very short term. We have a disuse study, which is more along the lines of like clinical populations. If you were to cast a leg which is like a pretty cool study, actually. We'll
Yeah.
get some potentially mechanistic things from muscle memory there with trained individuals getting casted and seeing what the molecular signature is of them when they retrain and things like that. So I think it'll be a cool study, but not one that necessarily has a whole bunch of practical applications. And then in terms of where people can find me, I'm most active on Instagram, but I also post most of those Instagram shorts on YouTube. And I'm also working on a YouTube series, like a hypertrophy series, where I'm going to
Awesome.
cover as many topics as I can and really try to encapsulate the research and practical side of things. So I haven't posted any of the long form videos yet, but I'm 2 scripts in. So I'm really hoping that this year is the year where I really hunker down and get those out there because I think they'll be cool.
Yeah, no, man, that's awesome. And yeah, I already knew going in you had a ton of knowledge around hypertrophy, but obviously talking to you even more. And I feel like I could talk to you for hours about this stuff. And yeah, it's cool. I feel like with a lot of people seem to be switching over to YouTube and stuff. That seems to be where a lot of like social media is headed. Definitely be on the lookout. I'll link all those in the show notes. And again, man, really appreciate your time. A ton of great information on here, and we'll definitely get you back again in the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot, man. It's fun.
Yep, talk to you soon.